Welcome to Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast focused on helping organizations navigate the changing healthcare industry. The podcast features discussion around current events within the healthcare industry and how leaders can effectively overcome challenges. My name is Mark Reibold. I'm your host. This is episode 4, and we're excited for this episode of the podcast as we're joined by Michele Madison, who's a partner in the healthcare group at Morris, Manning & Martin law firm here in Atlanta, Georgia, and is someone that I've known and worked with for over 10 years now and have come to really respect and value what she does for her clients and our mutual clients. And I really enjoy working with Michele. And recently, Michele and I actually had the opportunity to co-present a session at the American Health Lawyers Association Transactions Conference in Nashville, Tennessee. And it was actually a great session and was well attended, a lot of positive feedback and interest in the topic. And so we thought it made sense for us to continue the discussion and maybe, have a chance to drill down on some of the points that we weren't able to just because of time, or we weren't able to drill down more specifically during the session at the conference itself. And so there were a number of questions as well that people had that we just didn't have time to get to all of them. So we thought it made sense to just regroup and kind of continue our discussion and maybe answer some of those questions. But the topic we presented on was post-merger integration. But really what we were talking about is achieving value from transactions quicker and more efficiently through effective post-merger integration. And it was, again, I think it's one of these things that, frankly, there's nothing revolutionary about some of the points here. But as I've worked with hospitals and health systems and medical groups for a number of years now on transactions, and as Michele has worked with her clients on transactions, we've noticed that the more you can do through the transaction process to really start preparing and laying the groundwork for integration, the quicker you are to kind of achieve that targeted ROI. And frankly, the more you increase the probability that you'll be able to achieve that targeted value that you're ultimately going for with the transaction itself. And so this is I think a very relevant topic today. I know in terms of working with my clients and Michele with hers, but as we have been going through this period of consolidation within the healthcare services sector for a number of years now, which doesn't seem like it's going to pick up anytime soon, we thought it was a topic that was definitely worth not only talking about. AHLA obviously thought it was relevant in terms of talking about this topic at their transactions conference. But again, we thought it made sense for us to continue the discussion. And we'd love to get feedback, questions, suggestions, or comments on this topic. And we can even address them on another episode where we talk about it a little bit more. But other than that, we will provide the information to our presentation material. I think AHLA has some additional reference material available as well on this topic, as well as other content that was presented at this particular conference. So I encourage everyone to follow those links that we'll provide in the show notes for this episode. Of course, you can find all of our show notes and information on all of our podcast episodes at our website, cokergroup.com. And we'll also provide additional information at the end of this episode, as well as in the show notes for Michele and Morris Manning, and again, any of the other reference material that we talk about here in the discussion. And finally, the last thing I'll mention before we start the interview with Michele, but I just apologize. I was dealing with a cold and losing my voice, but I didn't want to put off the discussion with Michele, so we went ahead and kind of pushed through. But I do apologize for the sound, for at least for me, and hopefully you guys can bear through it and still get some good information from it. We thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to getting any comments or questions, feedback as it relates to this or any other of the topics we talk about here. So with that, let's go into the discussion with Michele. Welcome, Michele Madison.
Thank you.
Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here. I've been really looking forward to having you in to talk about this subject today. As we mentioned in the intro, this is a recap of our discussion that we presented, our topic that we co-presented at the recent AHLA Transactions Conference in Nashville here just last week as we're recording now. But it seemed to go really well, and we thought it definitely made sense for us to kind of walk through some of the things we talked about in the presentation, but also give us a little bit of chance to provide a little bit more color and maybe commentary, as well as address some of the other things that came up in questions or as we talked to people there at the conference that were kind of relevant to the topic. So I thought, this is a good opportunity for us to continue the discussion, if you will. But before we jump into the content, Michele, why don't you just give us a little bit of background on you and give you a chance to kind of explain what you do for everyone and things you have going on right now in terms of your work.
Well, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me today. So I am a healthcare attorney, and I've worked in healthcare my entire life. I just celebrated 20 years of being an attorney. But before thank you. So before being an attorney, I actually worked in a hospital in the healthcare system, working on the operational side, and then went to law school after working through medical staff credentialing and assisting on credentialing for a long-term acute care facility. So once I went to law school, I knew I was going to do healthcare. And then coming out of law school, I have worked at hospitals and healthcare systems, both in-house and then what I call out-house, and also working with physician practices and other healthcare entities on their regulatory compliance. So I do a lot of counseling with clients on structuring deals so they comply with Stark, anti-kickback, the federal laws and the state laws that may apply, including corporate practice of medicine. Now the Controlled Substances Act is a big deal. Mm-hmm. And so working through HIPAA and some other regulatory items that need to be addressed through transactions. And today I work with both physicians, hospitals, larger healthcare systems, pharmacies. I have some concierge medicine practices, which are always fun. Mm. And then the other side of my practice works with healthcare IT companies that work in the service area, and they address the regulatory side of how do you work in the healthcare industry and what do you need to do from a contractual standpoint, drafting those contracts and negotiating them.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that that last piece on health IT, because I know one of the big areas where your firm, Morris Manning and Martin here in Atlanta, you guys do a lot there as well as on the services side. So yeah, it's interesting. We've probably known each other over 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't realize you had worked kind of on the operations side before you went the legal route. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it gives you a little base of how does healthcare actually work.
Oh, yeah.
And when I have young attorneys who are coming out of law school and they ask, well, how do I get into healthcare law? I always tell them, go work in a healthcare facility, figure it out, see how it operates, because it's completely different than a normal job.
Even as an attorney, you worked on the in-house counsel side, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah, I thought so. And yeah, I think that's a good point. It's funny. We live here in Atlanta. Coker is based here in Atlanta. I know Morris Manning is based here in Atlanta, but you guys do stuff all over, as do we. But we know if there is a community hospital and large physician group, small physician group, anywhere around the state of Georgia, you know of them, you've been there, you probably represent or have represented many, if not most of them. So for everyone listening, that's I consider Michele as kind of the who's who of healthcare law, particularly in Georgia, but not just in Georgia, obviously.
Well, thank you.
We'll dive into the and by the way, we'll make sure we provide information on where people can find Michele, how to contact her, how to get more information in terms of what Morris Manning does in these different areas. But jumping into the discussion here, so our presentation at AHLA was on post-merger integration. There was a little bit of discussion, I think, in some of the other sessions as it related to due diligence, which we'll talk a good bit about here in a minute, and maybe a little bit on the back end of a deal. What I thought was really interesting, and this is one of the only dedicated discussions on the topic of integration, and that's kind of common that I've seen at conferences where we're talking about healthcare transactions, because in my opinion, it's one of the most overlooked areas or most underestimated components of a deal, because we tend to think, all right, getting this deal done, it's going to be hard, it's going to take a lot of time, it's going to obviously cost a good bit. just to get it done, not to mention the actual investment that goes in the transaction itself. But then it's kind of like, oh, okay, we're done, and everybody can celebrate type thing. But the reality is the hard work really begins after the deal is done. My whole thinking on this, and where I really started thinking about the topic, or where it became acute for me, was in working with my clients doing transactions. I started to see a pattern of, those that did kind of the traditional route of, hey, we'll worry about integration later. There was a stark difference from those that I noticed really got ahead of the curve, or attempted to get more ahead of the curve as it related to what are we going to do with this thing after the deal is done. And, I started noting to myself on all the deals I was working on, the nature of outcomes, or kind of how successful the deal was in the long run, however you quantify that, or however you want to measure that, really did correlate to how much effort and attention are we putting to integration. And so for me, it's very much a topic that relates to the deal itself. It is not something that should be an afterthought. And I think it behooves organizations and leadership in organizations to make sure they can do whatever they can to get ahead of it during the deal. The other thing is I think it's also a universal issue to all transactions, particularly within healthcare services. Meaning, it doesn't matter in my mind if you are doing a $500 million health system merger of multiple hospitals and that type of thing, or a maybe $500,000 acquisition of a single physician practice by a hospital where you're just buying tangible assets and they are. The same principles kind of apply, and the same thought process, I think, applies in terms of, hey, what we really need to focus on, obviously we got to get the deal done, but we also really need to start thinking about what is the long-term vision, strategy, and implementation plan here. So that's ultimately what we're talking about here. I don't know if you want to provide any additional thoughts on that.
No, I think that's right. I mean, the return on investment is what you need at the end of the day if you're an organization and an enterprise trying to grow through acquisition. And so if you don't put in place the proper steps during due diligence and the beginning of the transaction to make sure that there's a full understanding going post-transaction, the day of the close could be a disaster, because you may have just bought a lot of assets that you don't know what you're going to do with, or you may have just bought an entirely new service line that you don't know how to integrate it into your other parts of your health system. So having that project plan and the communication on both sides with the right expectations, so that you have an integration roadmap to actually achieve success, and defining what that success is going to be in the beginning, I think is a key component and a critical foundational component.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And for me, what do we mean when we say making a transaction work, air quotes? I think there's obviously going to be individual metrics for each individual deal, but for the most part, or at least at a high level, I think, first of all, there has to be compelling, validated value created from the transaction long term. And that's kind of the second point. It has to be value created over an extended period of time. It can't just be this accretion dilution effect that we tend to think of traditional merger and acquisition, stock price adjustments, things like that. There's a lot more to a healthcare services deal in terms of making it create value over a period of time. And I think it has to create value for all the stakeholders involved. And when you're talking about healthcare services, it's not just stockholders, in a publicly traded company. It's not just, hey, I'm cashing out to go sit on the beach or whatever. There's long-term impact, and the impact is on more than just the primary parties of the transaction. Particularly when you're talking about a hospital, or whether it's a community hospital or academic health system or our physician group, the idea or the reality that the deal impacts not only the buyer, the seller, but you also have the community that you're already serving, the marketplace. And it's not just a market. It can't be viewed as purely a market, but it truly is a community. It's a patient base. It's critical services that are needed, particularly in community health environments.
And on that point, I think some of the most rewarding projects that we work on are the ones where they're adding services in an area where they didn't exist before. So one of the greatest ones, and we've had several of these that I think are the most rewarding, where you've got a patient population in a community that didn't have access to oncology care in the community. They had to travel a good 45 minutes or an hour to get their medical oncology. And when you're getting that chemotherapy treatment, it's repetitive. And so traveling on a constant basis, and transportation is a big issue in a lot of the Southeast. And so being able to facilitate the development of an oncology center in a community hospital, just the purpose of the transaction and making sure it's integrated appropriately post-close is critical, because you want that service line for the community to ease the community's burden, but you want it to last. You don't want it to be we bought it, the machines are here, you can have your chemo here, but the service line isn't right, or the nurses weren't trained properly, or we don't have the right workflow to get the patients in and out correctly. All of that has to be thought about ahead of time to make it successful at the end of the day. But those are the most rewarding projects when you can really serve the community.
Very well said, and it's a great point. And I think it is something we overlook, because especially for us as advisors, and maybe you've probably seen this too in terms of outside legal counsel and their involvement, but it really is about more than just hey, we're trying to get this deal done and cash at close, and financial adjustments, and what's the economic terms, things like that. But the impact is important, and I think we can't lose sight of that. All the more reason for integration to be a priority. By the way, for our listeners, we'll make the copies of the slides that we presented at AHLA available. I think they're also available from AHLA. So to the extent that we're able to provide those directly, we certainly will, and make sure everybody can figure out where to find them. We're kind of walking through some of the key points here. And I know once we kind of figure out, okay, integration is important, one of the things that we talked through in our presentation, Michele, was this framework for increasing long-term value as a result of the transaction. And, there are a couple of overarching points here, and we'll walk through a couple of them. But I think one of the interesting things here is, or a point to make is, none of this is revolutionary. This isn't a silver bullet remedy or solution to guaranteeing deals are successful. But these are some basic steps that I think we found through working on many transactions and advising clients or observing clients or others in the marketplace, that doing more of these things can help increase that value. Missing some of these things can be detrimental to achieving that value. And so while some of these may seem obvious, I think one of the first things that we jump into is just making sure there's a validated strategy and strategic vision for why are you doing the deal in the first place. And, and we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but, in healthcare, particularly healthcare services, it's not just about valuation, right? I mean, let's face it, we do all kinds of business valuation, comp valuation, and the guidelines are fairly, I don't want to say straightforward. There's certainly plenty of gray area, but there's not a lot of wiggle room to negotiate economic terms typically. The valuations in these deals kind of are what they are, and there may be a little variation, but it's not like buying a car, buying a house, where you're going back and forth and saying, this is my offer, this is my counter, this is my counter, and you may go through that process, but a lot of times it's not the economic terms that we're really negotiating. In fact, most of the deals I've done, valuation is what it is, and it's not the primary pieces we're working on. What I have seen is kind of a traditional mindset where it's kind of like, okay, yeah, we know the players in the marketplace. Yeah, the deal makes sense. Can I really point to any sort of measurable, quantifiable targets as to why it makes sense, or can I articulate exactly how it makes sense? Maybe not, but we know enough about the market to know, kind of a gut feeling type mindset, I guess. And in my opinion, I think we need more in terms of strategic validation. What are your thoughts there?
Now, I think you've got to have a communication about why are we doing this on both sides, because if it's a hospital physician transaction, it's what's the hospital's goal, what's the physician's goal, and what are the expectations post-close. If it's a hospital transaction, there are a lot of different things you've got to consider. There are a lot of regulations that we have to consider. We've got to look at the FTC in addition to the Stark and anti-kickback and all the other laws that we consider. And so if we don't have a validated strategic plan where everybody's on the same page going in, then when you go to negotiate the documents, when I go into a transaction and there is inconsistency in what the hospital expects and the physicians expect or the two hospitals expect, negotiating or drafting those documents is incredibly difficult because you're never going to get to final terms when you start out on the wrong page. Yeah. So that's a really important part to start from.
I really like this simple but extremely effective framework here you call the 3 C's in terms of defining transaction strategy. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah, I have to make everything very simple.
I like it. It's good for me.
So the 3 C's are compliance, communication, and compensation, because in every deal that we do as part of the due diligence, we have to look for the compliance side. And in almost every deal with Stark and anti-kickback, you're always looking at, is there a risk here to the purchaser? And if there's a risk, how do we mitigate that risk before we get to close? Or how do we deal with that risk post-close? And a lot of times we'll put escrow agreements in place, or we'll deal with if we have to do self-disclosures or renegotiating agreements prior to close to deal with that compliance issue. There is always a component of compliance. And if you miss looking at compliance or looking at the regs, you could wind up with something post-close that you had no idea was coming that could really crater not only the deal in the target transaction, the hospital or physician practice you were buying, but it could ultimately hurt the overall enterprise. And then the second C is communication, which kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier, setting those expectations, being upfront. So if I'm a hospital and I'm selling to a larger hospital and I know that, hey, we didn't have written agreements for 10 years and that's a problem, I might want to communicate that a little early so we can address that prior to getting too far into the deal so that it can be addressed maybe through a self-disclosure or an escrow agreement.
Yeah, getting in front of it early on makes a big difference.
Absolutely. You don't want to blindside your purchaser. You need that trust and integrity in those discussions going forward.
And Michelle, how many, sorry to interrupt you, but I remember this kind of came up in our presentation, but how many of those deals have we been involved in where the hospital CEO met for dinner with the lead physician of a group or, another CEO of another hospital at the club and, or whatever, they saw each other in an event and kind of the next day they follow up and say, okay, by the way, we agreed to this deal. You guys go ahead and do your paperwork and your financial analysis. And, by the way, turn that around in a couple of days for me so we can go ahead and lock this down.
Right. No, it happens way too often. And what's really bad is if they've talked about doing something and there's a regulatory risk to it, having to back them off of that deal. And then your CEO loses integrity with his physicians who's on his medical staff, and he needs that integrity and that honesty with that doc. So it harms the relationship when somebody gets out in front of a deal before the compliance and the risk is analyzed. Yeah. So while your CEO doesn't want his attorney at every dinner, having some framework of here are the types of deal points we can offer before going into that dinner is often helpful, and it keeps that integrity between the two parties.
Yeah, and what I've said to a lot of my clients that you don't need to bring your consultant or your attorney, like you said, to every single dinner. Not even to every meeting. It's important though, that CEO or that management team to have those relationships, whether it's with physicians in the community or other stakeholders. And so that's fine. But when you are maybe going into a conversation where a potential transaction may be in the discussion or on the horizon, if you will, then, at least just tee it up at a very high level and go ahead and set the tone that, okay, but we need the consultants, we need the lawyers, other people on the management team to come in, and this is a process. We're not trying to overcomplicate it. We're not trying to drag it on forever. But the more everybody can be on that same page that there are just some things that have to get done, and it's not just a handshake. After all, I feel like that goes a long way in terms of setting expectations.
Oh, yeah. And you've got to manage those expectations. And the problem is if you don't go in with something that is legal, at least from a framework standpoint, and you've got to back off of it, the next time you go back, they may not believe you.
That's right.
So it's really that trust factor.
Credibility, yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry. Before we move on, I want to make sure, because I cut you off, in terms of the 3 C's. You feel...
The third C was just compensation, not that the compensation rules the day on the transaction, but getting it right in the document, because there are lots of convoluted ways that compensation works. And so on an asset purchase deal, it might be that we're buying these assets, but some of the money is going to go in escrow, and that escrow will break in 2 years after we deal with maybe some regulatory items that we identified. Or maybe it's an escrow in the event there's some liability that pops up during that 2 years that we're not aware of. And so that's your safety zone. And then I like to have an escrow agreement if we think there's anything that may arise over that time period, because if it have a physician group and a hospital doing a deal, the physicians would feel a lot better about getting a check when that escrow breaks versus writing a check if there was no escrow.
Yeah.
That's very difficult.
Yeah, good point.
So it just feels better sometimes.
It's hard to get that money back once you've already written a check and it's cashed in the bank or deposited in the bank.
That's right. That's right.
Well, and also with again, another unique thing about healthcare services deals is that it's not typically going to be all about, particularly hospital physician deals, not about the upfront money. We went through that in the 90s and early 2000s, and we saw how well that,
Right.
big cash at close, paydays, how well that worked out for everyone. And so you always have an element of, yes, here's what we're paying. It's, assets. You're doing something with the AR, whatever the valuation methodology went into the enterprise, but then you have whatever the ongoing agreement was, whether it's an employment agreement, a PSA, but ongoing compensation. That's the significant portion of any transaction, particularly with a physician, that, that's a significant component of the economic terms, and that's honestly where the complexities come in typically.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
Great. All right, so let's talk for a second about due diligence, because I know we talked about this in our discussion at the conference, and I know you obviously do a lot as it relates to due diligence, particularly on the legal, regulatory, compliance side, and we do a lot of due diligence on the financial and operational side. So we enjoy working with legal counsel through the due diligence process. One of my observations on due diligence has been that in the past, the traditional way of doing due diligence is very much kind of a checklist item. It can be treated as kind of mindset of, all right, we're just trying to identify deal killers, which obviously you got to do. I mean, needless to say, you want to identify those, address those, and move on one way or another. But as it relates to integration, we found that this is where integration starts, in my opinion, meaning due diligence. And one of the things I have that I do, this is not hard and fast, but I call it my 80-20 rule. But I think 20% of due diligence in terms of the transaction process should be that identifying the deal killers. Right. And in my opinion, you may disagree or kind of look at it a little differently, because there's such a huge legal component here. But I feel like the things that are going to kill a deal are typically going to be in a couple of key areas. I mean, you're probably looking at, it can be in the rev cycle, it can be on payer contracts, maybe it can be on coding and compliance as far as that goes. Obviously, legal, litigation, those types of matters. Those types of things, I feel like we can find between good legal counsel and some good business advisors. We can drill down and at least try to get indicators that there may be bigger issues that we can dig into.
Yeah.
The other 80%, though, in my mind, starts to really move more into integration planning and using the due diligence to really start getting ahead of that curve as it relates to, all right, a lot of other stuff here aren't necessarily going to kill the deal. They aren't such bad red flags that we need to put a halt on everything. But, there's definitely stuff we're going to have to do to kind of get it on the right track. And the sooner we can do that, ideally during during the transaction process itself, then the sooner we're going to be able to jump right into actual integration and be kind of ahead of the game there. So,
now, I think from a due diligence standpoint, I think it actually impacts how integration is going to work. So I kind of break it into the different subsections. Like, I'm going to use a hospital buying a smaller hospital. So I look at it as, on the due diligence side, what's the infrastructure needs? Are we going to have to put in $10 million into this facility to make it work? Or should we just convert this facility into an ambulatory surgical center and an imaging center? Yeah. What's the best need for that building? And then communicating with the two parties, what's your expectation post-close? Because that integration plan is very different than you're going to be an operating hospital. And then the other part is the contracts on the due diligence. There could be clauses in some of those contracts, like a buyout of a doc if there's a change of control. Or what happens, if you bought, I'm going to give an example where a larger hospital is buying a smaller hospital, and that smaller hospital did a deal with a physician group previously, and maybe they did a joint venture ASC. and that joint venture ASC goes away in the event of a change of control. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Because if the bigger hospital thought they were going to have this ASC and now they don't, that could be a real game changer on both the financial side and the strategic planning of where they were going.
Yeah, it absolutely would impact the valuation. So,
yeah. So I think that's a big part. And the managed care contracts are obviously important. And then replacement of, okay, if I've got a hospital buying another hospital and they've got an old MRI, how much is that going to cost me to replace it? And am I in a state that has CON laws or LNR laws, and do I deal with that? And then the other side on the due diligence is really related to litigation, obviously. That's a big part. Taxes and debts. So what kind of loans are out there? Is it secured? Is it going to be satisfied at the time of the close? And then the one that I feel like kind of sneaks up on you are the benefit plans. So if you've got a hospital buying another hospital and the other hospital entity is going to wind itself down, what kind of benefit plans did they have, and what kind of post liability is out there, and do they have the resources to deal with it? Because winding down a benefit plan is not the easiest thing.
No. And it absolutely will be a major component. Again, it may not be big enough to make everybody go separate ways, but it will have to be addressed very quickly.
And some of these hospitals had 457F plans, and so you want to make sure they were funded during that time period, because you might be walking into a very large unfunded liability.
That's great.
So looking at all of that in due diligence, I think, is important. And then depending upon what the answers are to those questions, you may change your strategic direction post-close. So if you lost that ASC, you may say, okay, well, we lost that JV, but let's do a JV over here with this other group of physicians, and let's get that rolling while we're doing due diligence so we're up and going at the time of close. And then looking at the staffing, I think from a due diligence standpoint, whenever you're taking on a new target, physician practice, hospital, whatever it may be, what does their staff look like, and are they all coming over? Because when you've got staff that's not coming over, and this is a key component of the transaction documents, are they employing all the current employees under the same benefit level that they're under today? And if not, that's a conversation that the human resources director and whoever's in charge of HR at the target need to have prior to us getting that into the documents.
That reminds me of a transaction we worked on. This has been a few years, but it was a hospital acquisition by another health system, and there were a number of employees that had accumulated over 1,000 hours of PTO.
Wow.
That's a half a year essentially of time off. And first of all, it wasn't the buyer's policy. Was I think it was restricted to you capped out somewhere like 100 or something like that, which is fairly typical. But, they couldn't just be like, oh, yeah, by the way, you lost, 90% of your PTO that you had accumulated over years. So that was something that had to be worked through. Also, there's a lot of hospitals where, you have union involvement, and whether it's a nursing union or otherwise, you can't obviously underestimate those. They're going to be a key stakeholder in the transaction itself. So that's something to get in front of there. My version of, like you said, you like your kind of simple model. My version of my simple explanation as it relates to due diligence is what I call just my red, yellow, green assessment. And this is a very, very broad kind of description of one of the ways we look at due diligence. And you essentially have these three categories where if something is identified in due diligence that's in the red column, those aren't just red flags, but those are your deal killers. Those are the things that you uncover and you're just like, okay, this changes too much, or this alters kind of what we're going after in terms of long-term value. We need to probably take a step back, or if there's litigate some sort of legal issues that you uncover that obviously helps make that decision for you. But really, where you focus more on are the yellow and the green, and kind of the other end of that continuum is the green areas, where these are your good to go areas essentially as you look at them in due diligence. But from an integration standpoint, we all know it's not going to be difficult, or it's not that unreasonable for a green item to go yellow really quick. So you have to have plans to ensure what are the items in the green zone remain in that green zone,
right.
After the deal is done. And then yellow is what just the areas of improvement. Those are those things where you identify that we don't necessarily need to stop the transaction from going through because of this. However, we need to address them, and you can go in and you can almost triage them and in terms of acuity, prioritize and kind of say, here are the things that are very, there's a threat here that could go from yellow to red if we don't address them early on, or it's going to cost more or require more effort to ensure or prevent them from kind of going into that territory. And then also have a plan to try to figure out, okay, what are also the things that we can go ahead and identify as yellow, but we're confident they're going to be green pretty soon. And so it's a real simple way of breaking down the categories of and prioritizing due diligence in such a way that we know where we need to focus when it comes to integration.
Right.
And I like that.
I think that roadmap is helpful for both sides to know what's in red, yellow, and green, and where are our issues, because there may be explanations that we can't see as we're doing due diligence and we look at documents. There may be a complete explanation for why something is the way it is that's not so much a red flag. Maybe it's yellow and we can address it. And so having that communication is important, and sharing with them what's red, yellow, and green is important.
Absolutely. I want to talk for a second. You have alluded to this a little bit, but as it relates to regulatory risk, I think this is something we actually didn't get as much time to talk about it in our presentation at the conference. This is a topic that is not only extremely critical, but I've seen so many deals being either held up for much longer than they should have, or not going through at all because something related to regulatory.
Sure.
And I think some of these are, some of them, whatever. Things come up and you can't avoid them. But a lot of them, we know you could address these. You could go ahead and identify these early on and start addressing them, not at the last minute, and then have to kind of scramble or delay the deal. I mean, I'm seeing more and more transactions going on for literally years. And almost every single case I can think of, it's regulatory related.
Yeah, that's where the attorneys, everybody says, oh, here come the attorneys. But the problem is we are highly regulated in healthcare. So you have Stark and you have anti-kickback and you have FTC concerns. And so looking at, and really from a Stark perspective, I tell all of my clients that are potentially looking at selling in the future, do your Stark analysis now. And when I say Stark analysis, I mean pull your AP list of everybody that you pay money to that's a referral source, and then match it up with, do I have a written contract for them? And do they satisfy a Stark exception? Because if they don't, Stark is strict liability. And so if you find that issue in a deal and it's a big issue, then the other side, the purchaser may say, well, I want you to resolve that before I'm going to buy you.
Sure.
And resolving that's not easy. So you have to do a self-disclosure. And once you self-disclose, you're in the queue with CMS for resolution, which can take years. And so that could delay a deal. Or they may close over it, but they may put an escrow amount. So they might say the purchase price of this hospital was $80 million, but we have no idea where this is going to get resolved on this issue. So we're going to put $10 million in escrow, and hopefully it'll resolve for less than that, and then you'll get the excess in 5 years.
That's really good. That's a good point, and that's actually great advice in terms of going through your AP and having specific Stark compliance efforts related to tied to each one. I think that even should go without speaking about a transaction.
Absolutely.
That's really something they should have anyway.
It should be part of your effective compliance program. And if you've never done one before, it will open your eyes on who you pay money to for the most random things, whether it's a lease or it's a medical director agreement, and just looking at those agreements to make sure they're compliant. And from that standpoint, you also have anti-kickback. And so when you deal with anti-kickback, there's also a self-disclosure process, but that goes through the OIG. And anti-kickback is a criminal statute. So there's a lot more at stake. Stark is strict liability, civil penalties, but they can get False Claims Act, so the penalties are pretty darn high. Anti-kickback's a criminal statute. So when a purchaser sees a potential anti-kickback issue, so much worse. Now, anti-kickback means that someone actually intended to provide some form of remuneration to someone to induce referrals. Most people in healthcare are not out there trying to give money away or give some form of remuneration to induce referrals, but these relationships should fall within a safe harbor if they're legitimate. Yeah. And so making sure that your contractual relationships with your referral partners or referral sources are compliant with Stark and anti-kickback ahead of the game, very important. And then if you identify something as you're going through the transaction, try to put your Stark and anti-kickback due diligence at the beginning, because if you need to do a self-disclosure, getting that filed is important, and getting it filed early. It's a long process and it takes a while.
And we know that if you're looking at from the seller's perspective, your example about if you do need to go back, if the buyer says, hey, you got to get this resolved before we can move forward. If you are a seller in a scenario where you need that deal or you need that buyer, whether you're distressed or you're at that point where this is a little bit more of a one-sided perspective in terms of value, and we know those happen. Unfortunately, not every deal is a merger of equals.
Right.
But if you are in that situation, you may not really have that ability to go back. You may not have the time, or that's, again, a lot of resources you're going to have to put into going back and doing that after the fact. So getting ahead of it.
If you've got a target who's having a liquidity crisis, it could be the end.
Yeah, that's
so
right. That's right.
Very important.
And we've seen that happen, unfortunately. You mentioned something, you alluded to it earlier, but it also came up in our discussion at the conference. Some of the things you guys are doing around compliance, around kind of the opioid crisis, and that's such a hot topic right now from, I guess, multiple perspectives. But I was interested to hear what you guys are doing there. So
yeah, it's a gigantic issue. In fact, this morning, the Attorney General for Georgia, Chris Carr, announced that he wants to hire more litigators just to deal with opioid litigation.
Really?
Yeah. And then you've got the Department of Justice with the Opioid Task Force. I mean, this is a super priority at the federal enforcement level. Yeah. So going into the pharmacies and looking at, do you have a manual inventory tracking system or an electronic tracking system? How do you evaluate your inventory? Do you do it every 6 months, every month, every quarter, twice a year? Figuring out what that schedule is. And then how do you track your diversion reports? So if you've got an electronic tracking system, the system is supposed to flag you. So is the system flagging you, number one? And how often do you run those reports? And then who all within the pharmacy is authorized to handle controlled substances that are Schedule 2s through 5? And how does that process work? And so you look at inventory. You look at where they keep their records. So the DEA can go back 2 years when they're auditing records. And so where do you keep all your prescriptions for those last 2 years? Are they all electronic? Are they paper? How does that work? What state are you in? Do they have other state obligations?
Right.
And then what's the inventory tracking system? What's your diversion reporting? Do you have your DEA Forms 222 and all the ordering forms? And then looking at your normal orders on a monthly basis on your C2s in relation to your hospital, it takes it one extra step, but looking to make sure that you're ordering what's appropriate, because you'll see in these cases that are out there now, there's all this multi-district litigation against the manufacturers because they're saying, well, you should have told us that we ordered this amount. We didn't realize this was what was happening. And so that's such a multifaceted issue that if you can at least start looking at your pharmacy controls, who has access to your pharmacy, how do you do inventory, is it electronic or manual, and then how do you do your diversion analysis and reporting is important.
Yeah, and that's another example. This is certainly a topic for another day, but it's kind of sad. We've seen this coming. We should, and I say we, the industry should have seen something like this coming. Unfortunately, it took kids dying and rehab rates and going up and addiction rates and all that. Again, that's aside the point, but this is stuff, again, that's coming regardless of talking about a transaction or not.
Right.
Obviously, if you're looking to do a deal and these factors are there, most hospitals are going to have some sort of pharmacy component. Now, a lot of physician groups. We've done a number of pain management deals. Yeah. And I found that going into most markets, the key players, they know which ones are the true quality, whether it's a pain management or ortho group or whatever, and versus the pill pushers. I think, they've kind of known it, but even the good quality groups and physicians doing what they're supposed to do may not have the documentation to actually show that for whatever reason, whether it's a IT system issue or, like you said, kind of in terms of manual versus electronic tracking and inventory. Accountability is going to be there whether or not you're philosophically on the right page and doing your job as a clinician. On the business back end, that can make a big difference.
And the systems that are electronic to track, they're expensive.
Absolutely, yeah. And
so you'll have some physician pharmacies inside their practice where they can't afford that, and it is a manual process. So it does raise risk, and so you've got to, especially now, really focus on it. The Controlled Substances Act has civil penalties that just for lack of reporting or lack of documentation maintenance, they can get you.
Absolutely. So that's common. So let's talk about structure. Walk us through kind of your thoughts on, and in terms of how the structure of a deal impact the structure of integration and kind of how those relate, and ultimately how deal structure ties into, how a deal can result in long-term value.
I mean, the two biggest types of deals are either the asset deal where you're going to go in, you're going to buy the hard assets, here's the set in advance price on the valuation, and then you incorporate the individuals and the operations into the overall integration plan. And in those instances, it's a little easier, not a lot, but a little easier to cut off some of the liability, because you can say, that contract has that clause in it, we don't want it, you need to terminate it before close, or we're not going to take those contracts. Here's the excluded liability list that's going to be a schedule on our asset transaction. Versus an equity transaction. And I normally see equity transactions when we're in a state where you have a letter of non-reviewability or a CON law, certificate of need law. Mm-hmm. And letters of non-reviewability normally are very specific to the organization and the location. And so you can't sell an LNR.
Right.
And so you buy the equity in the company to keep the LNR because it's in the name of the company. Sure. But when you take the equity, you have a lot of liability that you may not be able to contract around. So when you take the equity, you're taking the tax ID number, you're taking that provider number, and there may be Medicare and Medicaid recoupments, there may be third-party contracts that you do not like, and there may be benefit plans you don't like. There may be a lot of things on an equity deal that are very difficult.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came up in the conference is one of the gentlemen asked about if you do an equity deal, what about the electronic medical record system? So if I'm a doc practice that's being sold to a hospital, but they're buying my practice because they want that ASC that's under a letter of non-reviewability, but I have, let's say, I don't want to throw out a vendor, but let's say I've got a system that doesn't integrate with the hospital system. Sure, and the hospital's just spent $1 bazillion on a new system that they're going to put in every one of their doctor practices.
Right.
And so that integration, when you've just bought the equity, you're stuck with that system that's there, and it has all your historical stuff on it. To just shelve it's a problem.
Yeah.
So that's another component of just an equity deal that you've got to think through a little bit more on post-integration.
Well, and we've all seen many deals that, particularly hospital physician related, that really the bulk of the value is kind of the focus on buying that CON. And,
right.
That the deal structure is going to affect that. Even on the LNR side, it used to be you could just kind of file for a new one, and it's a pretty straightforward process. But even if it's straightforward, that's not the case today necessarily in all states. But even if it is just a relatively straightforward process, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be quick.
Right.
And it's going to add time and other elements there. And I think it's interesting too. It just goes to show how it really is what you do on the front end of a deal really is going to affect how quick, what that path to value looks like. And so I think just as important getting the right deal structure in place in terms of the transaction, but also putting some structure and parameters to the integration itself. And one of the things we recommend early on is leadership driving integration through the deal process and setting governance, the different components, all of those things that will facilitate that actually happening. Because it's one thing to say we intend to do this and hey, we're talking about doing it, but when you start putting structure and you put people in place and investing resources to really doing it right, that looks different. I know we have again another kind of simple model that we have the transaction management office and the integration management office, the TMO and the IMO. And for us, these are kind of, again, basic concepts, but both the TMO is essentially the central entity that's driving the management facilitation of the transaction process. And then the IMO is the same thing for integration. And the idea is that you have a seamless transition from TMO or the transaction process through the integration process with the IMO. You're probably going to have even some overlap there in terms of who's involved, who's ultimately involved in those different entities. But actually setting up specific structures and parameters that allow you to do what you want to do here as it relates to getting the deal done the most effective way and then jumping right into integration. Obviously, I think one of the biggest elements there is leadership. You got to have leadership that's prioritizing and driving those priorities throughout the process. And then governance is critical, to making sure that those people that are kind of responsible for doing these things have the ability and the resources to kind of do what they need.
Well, and I think it's right to bring people from both sides of the transaction onto those teams.
Yeah, good point.
They need to have that ability to work together before the closing date so that you know whether or not it's going to be successful going forward. Because you may have some people that are pretty resentful about a transaction happening. They may not be the best leader moving into that post-integration model.
Yeah, even the most pleasant of deals, you're going to have that a lot of times, not every time, but oftentimes you're going to have someone or some kind of area that is a little reticent, whether they're worried about losing their job or there's whatever issues, crosstown competitors, those types of things, whatever that may be. On a lot of hospital physician deals, there's almost always some degree of reticence on the physician side in terms of how the hospital is going to come in. Are they going to start looking over my shoulder, everything, every time I see a patient? Are they going to start dictating how I care for my patients, things like that? And that structure allows you, again, doing what we talked about earlier, just identifying some of those issues early on and go ahead and start addressing them. If a physician knows, these guys are really good to work with, they're telling me I'm not going to be dictated to. I don't really have to change anything in terms of the way I've done my clinical practice over the years. And they're saying there's going to be a structure in place for a management committee post-transaction, or if it's a PSA management committee, whatever that ends up looking like. But you're going to have role in that going forward and input. Then all the more reason for us to kind of be like, okay, we can probably get through some of these other issues. This makes sense even more.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. Well, really, that brings us through kind of our discussion. Ultimately, to final points that we had talked through in the conference was really all of this planning, the strategic vision, the due diligence process, the structure and functional teams through the due diligence and transaction process leading into integration. One of the things we think is so critical is what we call this integration roadmap. And, this can be as simple or as complex as it needs to be. We did a transaction years ago. It was a hospital acquisition of another hospital, probably $200 million in terms of value of the deal. Obviously, there's more value or more investment required than that in terms of the back end and getting it all done. And so that roadmap was extremely complex. I mean, it had hundreds of people involved, dozens of vendors and outside parties, different committees, and just, task lists that went on for pages and pages. It also went on for multiple years. But it was very detailed, and it was a step-by-step playbook of here's how we are going to go from two separate organizations coming together day 1 through day 100 and then day 100 plus. And that was critical. And we've seen that be the difference in terms of saving money on the back end through the integration process, and also reducing that timeline so that instead of, a deal taking 5 years to ultimately kind of come back full circle from an ROI standpoint, maybe you can hit that target in 1 or 2 years. Maybe.
Well, and you can set the goals and the expectations so are we hitting this, and what's the roadblock why we're not hitting it?
Right.
And and you've got both stakeholders at the table. So it's not, okay, well, this is a purchaser, this is a seller, we'll just deal with them at a different day. It's everybody at the table working together towards that same goal. So you integrate the culture of those two organizations together better to really create a framework where it's not him and me, it's us.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. And accountability is obviously a big thing there. And so the other thing it gives whether the buyer or you're looking at it from the seller's perspective, it gives people kind of ownership of it. Mm-hmm. It's not just accountability, but it says, hey, not only are you able to keep your job, or not only are we going to maintain this department or this particular area, but you guys are going to actually be responsible for implementing this thing. And so your value added day 1.
Right.
And that's meaningful, and particularly when you get at the individual level, you're talking about people's jobs and careers and things like that. So I think that's great.
I think I see that the most when we're taking on physician practices in a hospital, and the office manager is thinking, well, am I going to report to that VP? Is my job going away? Or getting them to understand that they're a critical component because they know how the operations of the practice work, and now we are going to maybe tweak how the operations of the practice work, but that person's an integral part of making that change.
Yeah, that's right. So. That's absolutely right. Makes a big difference. And you also alluded to kind of the metrics, and I think that's just as important too. You have to have a way, something to track. How are we doing? Are we on track? Are we off track? Okay, if we're off track, then where are we off track, and what do we need to do to fix that? It makes a big difference rather than kind of coming back 6 months after the deal is done, and you as a CEO or management team is having to explain to the board, what is going on with this thing? Okay, we bought this thing. What are you guys doing with it? Or what's the long-term plan, and where are we on that? So again, getting ahead of that game. And then finally, so this really leads you into the implementation piece. And, we said it kind of early on in our discussion, but at this point, so much of the work should have been done, ideally, so that you can essentially jump right in. Now, the key caveat or takeaway here is that, again, as I said earlier, this is really where the real work starts.
That's right.
So when the lawyers go away and the consultants go away and everybody's celebrating for the deal getting closed, the responsibility then is on the organizations to follow through with ultimately kind of why they did it in the first place and the plans that they put together to do it right. But in my opinion, the more prepared you can be, the better off you're going to be in the long run. And I think, well, I know from my observations, so much of a huge difference when you are sitting at that point of, okay, hey, we got this done, and the discussion is more on, okay, go right in to implementation, as opposed to, all right, now what do we need to do on integration type thing.
Right, and that goes back to that communication in the beginning. What did we communicate was our goal at the end of the day? And then on that closing date, it is implementing what that goal was. Yeah. And that's not something that happens on the first day. It's not like you walk in the day after closing and, it's all sunshine and rainbows. Yeah. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of, you're changing a lot of times you're changing the behavior and the culture inside an organization so that they are integrated together to get on the same page. And that is a long process and not one that you flip a switch on.
No, not at all.
So it's a lot. And some, unfortunately, in healthcare, we talk about policies and procedures and processes, but it is a process.
It is.
It's one that everybody has to take part in. You can't have the hospital come in and say, well, here's our policy, you just comply with it. It has to be a communication where the people in the practice say, well, this works, but this has to be modified because this doesn't work in how we treat care and how we treat patients.
Well said. So, again, I really thought this was a good conversation. That's really kind of where we ended in terms of the conference. But like I said, there's a lot here in terms of things that you can take and drill down further. So, but I always like to, with our guests, when we have them on the podcast, give you a chance, any, overall thoughts or conclusions, whether it's on the topic, also any other comments you have in terms of what you've seen and what you're doing in some of these areas and why it's relevant to people out there listening.
I think the overall conclusion from me, from a standpoint of what am I telling my clients to do now, healthcare is changing so much that there's going to be additional integration, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so that effective compliance program to keep you up to date on what's happening has to be implemented in your facility way ahead of the game. So in order to survive in healthcare, you've got to be on top of the changes. And in order to be on top of the changes, you've got to be tracking the laws as they're coming down. Yeah. And so making sure you're doing that STARK analysis, the anti-kickback review, staying on top of things so that if you ever are in a transaction, whether you're the purchaser or the seller, that you already have your ducks in a row and it's not going to be a roadblock to the deal getting closed. The other part is when you start to look at your transaction, really focus on the language in the documents. A lot of times people say, oh, it's your standard asset purchase agreement, have a nice day. That document is going to control how things happen for at least the next 5 years. You're going to have questions like, well, did they buy that? Did they not buy that? Did we terminate that contract? Was that on the excluded liability list? Those schedules are important. And a lot of times we'll get into a transaction and somebody will say, we'll get all the way down and the transaction is going to close supposedly in a week. And someone says, well, no one's done the schedules. Well, how do you not do the schedules? The schedules are a critical part of the
big placeholder though,
right?
The definitive agreement, insert schedule A. Here,
That's right. That's right. Here's the schedule that you need to do.
Yeah.
And so there's a real disconnect, and that's a lot of work to pull together those schedules. So starting that in the beginning is very important because it also determines the risk and the liability that needs to be addressed in the transaction documents. Yeah. So I think that's an important part. And then overall, just don't lose sight of communication. when we're in the healthcare operations side and we have a clinical issue, it typically comes down on the root cause analysis to some form of communication issue. Yeah. It's the same thing on a transaction. Yeah. Post-integrations that fail are because the expectations were not managed appropriately during due diligence and the communication was lacking. And so making sure you're successful at the end is setting what your goal is and communicating that through everything to be able to achieve that goal at the end of the day.
Yeah, good points. Well, like I said, really appreciate you not only co-presenting with me at the conference, but joining me to go into this discussion. I know we'll get a lot of questions and feedback, so may give us a chance to drill down even a little bit further later on. But we'll make sure we provide your information for people to find you and more information in terms of your practice and the firm and everything. But other than that, we thank you for being on, and we'll look forward to kind of further discussion on this stuff.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for including me in the presentation in Nashville. It was fun.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Yes.
Thanks, Michelle. That concludes our discussion with Michelle and our recap on our presentation from the AHLA Transactions Conference. Again, we thank everybody for listening, and we do want to provide a little bit more information on not only where you can find the material we talked about, but also how you can get a hold of Michelle or find more information in terms of her practice. And so their website, Morris, Manning & Martin, is mmmlaw.com. And you can reach out to Michelle directly via the website, or her email address is on that website. But that address is mmadison@mmmlaw.com. And then you can also find them on social media on Twitter at @mmm_law. And that's on Twitter, that's at @mmm_law. So feel free to reach out to Michelle or the Morris & Manning team there on their website or social media. And as we always say, as we're closing out our each episode of the podcast, we really welcome feedback from you all, our listeners. And we really want to encourage you all to provide feedback, or if there's questions that you have or comments on either anything that we've talked about in this episode or any episode, we would love to hear that. We would love to hear if you have different perspectives on anything, but also if there's something we didn't touch on in any of these discussions, or something that you would like to hear about, you would like us to talk about in a future episode. Please provide that feedback, because we absolutely will address it, and we will make sure that if it's something that is a topic that needs to be addressed, because it's related to what we do within this industry, then we absolutely want to make sure we do it. And we welcome that feedback. So where can you find us? The best place to start for us on the website, cokergroup.com. There you'll be able to find a link to the podcast where we have a blog post and show notes for every episode that we do. So if you need to find something specific to an episode, or if you want to go and listen to it directly via the website, that's the place to go. You can also find us on social media. I guess the best place to start is just with Twitter. And our Twitter handle is simply @Coker Group. And that's @COKER Group. And there you can find, you'll be able to access the Twitter handles for some of our people, our senior leaders, and follow our content and there as it relates to kind of where we're speaking and things we're talking about, and also get alerted for future episodes of the podcast and other material that we're putting out there. And then if you want to provide feedback for us, again, you can do that via the website, or just email us, and you can email us at feedback@cokergroup.com. So again, that's a great place to just start if you have comments or specific questions on a specific episode or something you'd like us to address in a future episode. So with that, we thank you for listening today to this episode and each and every episode. And we really look forward to engaging with you all through social media and on the podcast in the future. Thank you.